Amazing. Thank you so much for joining me, Jim. I really, really appreciate it. It's such a pleasure for that you're here, and I'm really excited.
Well, similarly, I'm keen to have this conversation, and not just with yourself, but hopefully for those that get a chance to tune in.
Yeah, no, definitely. So, I'm going to do a quick introduction because it really deserves one, and I'm very excited to discuss this book. So, excellent.
Great.
So, Jim Steele is a business speaker, executive coach, leadership facilitator, and one of the world's top business performance pioneers. Having gained experience at various levels of the organizational ladder, Jim understands the wide variety of challenges people face at every level in any business and has been doing so for the past 2 decades. He has been dedicating his career to finding practical and achievable solutions to these challenges. Drawing from cutting edge neuroscientific research, Jim is always seeking new solutions for the ever evolving challenges in today's fast paced business world. He has a particular passion for combining high performance with well being, the basis of the Unashamedly Superhuman book, which is what we're discussing today. So, Jim,
Bit of a mouthful.
yeah, it really is. I just can't say it, can I? I've got to ask before anything. Of course, I've got to ask.
Yeah.
What is your superpower?
Wow, that's a great question. Not a question anyone's ever asked me before. But I tell you what I've experienced certainly over the last few years. Um, I would say it's probably the ability to bounce back,
Mm.
right, and to take on challenges that. And look, I have a real simple motivation for taking on challenges, and that's to explore some tangible, practical answers to what's possible. And I don't mean that in a motivational sense. I mean, it is motivational, by the way, but I really mean it in a sense that, the book Unashamedly Superhuman, the sexy word is superhuman,
Mm.
but the most important word is unashamedly.
Mm.
And unashamedly being, the willingness to test yourself and challenge yourself and to find out genuinely, what we've got built into our system. And through the last few years of exploring that and testing it with a few challenges I took on, and also with the clients that I work with and people that I've observed, trying to find some processes that we can rely on when things are difficult, when things are challenging, or when we set ourselves goals that are exciting but maybe slightly out of reach.
Mm.
We got to draw on something. And so therefore, my if I have a superpower, it's the willingness to take on challenges with a view to trying to extrapolate some value from it over and above just achieving the goal. I'm really interested in the process more than anything else.
Yeah, no, I think that's a superpower because I don't think a lot of people can't do that or see the good or the silver lining in everything. So for sure. So okay, so how much of your potential do you believe you've tapped into, and how do we tap into our own potential?
Yeah, I mean, and that's a really, I tell you why I appreciate starting there. It's because when I started thinking about Unashamedly Superhuman, what I was trying to do was to demystify some cliches. And I've seen it and I've heard this, I've been in this sector, I suppose, for the last 25 years, working with organizations, working with teams, and trying to work out, how to access the best of people's capability. So let's call that potential. Um, but I hear oftentimes these cliches: we've got to tap our potential, we've got to change our mindset, we've got to become more resilient. And these are said with good intentions, but there's no value in those statements because they're just so vague, right?
Mm.
So a question I've been asking people, and I'm glad you asked me it, because I've been asking audiences this for the last 3 years: how much of your potential are you tapping? What's the
Mm.
number? What's the percentage? And in the chat box come hundreds of numbers pouring in: 50%, 60%, 92. I mean, quite specific answers, by
Yeah.
the way. But what you never hear, no one ever puts in the chat box 100%,
Mm.
ever. Intuitively, we all believe there's something to be accessed. There's something there to be had, right? No one's sitting there going, I'm tapping everything, Jim. I got nothing left, right? And I don't mean effort. They could be giving everything,
Mm.
but we've kind of intuitively feel there's something there to be had. And I guess what's interesting, there was a piece of research some years ago about the sort of performance psychology space. And what it suggested was that the human being was pretty much fully formed by the age of 25 in terms of their ability to develop things like focus, resilience, even empathy.
Mm.
It was like, you're done now. You can't get better at those things. But there was a guy called Robert Keegan from Harvard who did a long-term study. And he actually found that there were some people, a minority to be sure, that did manage to tap into something. And I don't mean new skills. Like, of course, we can learn new skills, learn a new language, play an instrument. But this was more about these intrinsic, psychological capabilities, like, again, focus, grit, determination. But what he found was some were, but what they managed to do, they managed to do two things. So to answer your question, how? The two things that were consistent with people that seemed to develop, and I suppose nowadays we call that a growth mindset. This is the phrase we're familiar with after Carol Dweck's book from Stanford on mindset. And he said there were two things. First of all, they had an ability to observe opposing views on a topic. They weren't fixed in their mindset that this is the way it is. They seemed to be able to step back and see things from different angles. And I guess, how does that relate to us? Well, whether you believe you're good at something, whether you believe you're capable, well, let's suggest my results would say I'm not. So I haven't delivered results in a certain area. So I can either form the view, well, that's me, I'm not good at that, right? Or what he was saying, Robert Keegan, was that people kind of suspended that doubt. And, well, what if there was a way to develop it? And they were able to hold these opposing views. The second thing they were able to do was have flexibility in the way they define themselves. And I mean their identity of who they saw themselves as. I am. How do you finish that sentence? In other words, they were able to build their identity based on potential growth rather than past results. It's a little bit like you leave school or you leave college or university, and we form these beliefs that we are that person. And then 20 years later, I say, you were an educated person, and you go, well, I didn't go to university. And I go, yeah, but that was 20 years ago. That has nothing to do with whether you're educated 20 years later. So forming an identity based on what you're trying to achieve rather than what you've achieved in the past is a fundamental part of growth mindset. So how do we tap potential? Well, we have to start off with developing this mindset that there's possibility built into our DNA and our nervous system that we can always step outside of what we've done. And now the next thing is, well, how do you provoke that, right? How do you provoke, neural coding, new ways of thinking and doing? Well, you need either exciting ambition, something that you're moving towards, or some situational stress. And like most of us have got plenty of that in our lives, right? But if you've got some stress or some ambition, at least that provokes us to think, well, what am I going to do? How can I approach this differently? What do I need to become or learn? And it's a provocation for tapping into, let's use this phrase, potential, right? So once you set that up and you start moving towards something, you very quickly start to realize that either you're good enough or you're not. Now, if you're not good enough, that's fine. You hit the wall. Then you go, what have I got to get better at? So you start to develop. And then as you start to develop, you then start to really kind of tap into, again, the way the brain operates under pressure, seeking out new ways of thinking, new behavioral patterns that we require. Now, in the book, I get into some very specific hacks and techniques and strategies for that. But it all has to start with some form of need, whether that's by design or because of our circumstances. So, I think that's a starting point for most people. And by the way, we're coming up to January, where people are setting these resolutions for the year. And this time I mean it, I'm going to get healthy, fitter, more successful. But that's a good start. Look, I mean, there's not enough, but it's a place to begin. Having some aspiration to move towards something is a way of tapping into potential.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so, obviously in the book, a big part of the book was you taking on this insane challenge for doing the Ironman challenge from which is just already bonkers in itself. So what was the biggest challenge for you going from 0 to 100 when you were doing that?
Yeah, and I almost didn't put it in the book because there are plenty of people that have achieved physical feats of endurance that are way more impressive that they don't deem to be book worthy, right? So the book isn't about me doing an Ironman triathlon. But there's a dotted line through the book to this activity because I decided to take it on almost like, I wanted to be the lab rat. I wanted to have a metaphor other than business, whereby I had to find brand new strategies. As I mentioned in the book, I had my third knee operation about a year before, maybe 10 months before. I'd had 2 discs fused in my back, these rods screwed into my spine. So structurally, I wasn't coming at this with any sense of capability. And also, I ran the London Marathon in the year 2000, and within a year I was in hospital having my back fused. So, I had the belief systems like I'm not a runner, running's not good for you. I wasn't a sports person by any stretch of the imagination. So the reason I took on this particular challenge was because it was so ridiculous. But what that meant, I had to then start to really look for new ways of operating, right? New ways of not only taking on physical challenge and physical stress, but new ways of not only pushing myself, but also recovering. How do you recover from the training that's required? And I think that became the key element for me. I talked to a few people that knew what they were talking about. And they said, you've got to put as much emphasis on recovery as you do performance. And I took on that challenge before I got the book deal. But coincidentally, around the same time, I had a client who runs a global team for a firm that I work with. And she said, have you got any content that pulls together high performance and well-being? And I said, I genuinely said at the time, I'm not sure those two things go together. I think, you're either a full tilt go-getter, type A, or you look after yourself. It's one or the other. And she said, well, that's just not good enough anymore. And I said, well, no, I appreciate that, but I don't know the answer to your question. I said, give me a year. I'll go and think about it. And it all kind of came around about the same time that I took on this triathlon. And the triathlon was almost like provocation to answer her question, right? My goal was to achieve the triathlon, and I had to equal the global average for every finisher of of an Ironman triathlon at any age group. Which was 12 hours 33. So that was my performance goal. But equally important was my well-being goal, which was I had to finish the event and feel as good as I did before I started it. In other words, of course, I would be exhausted and I'd be tired and I'd be aching. I get that. But I couldn't be injured. I couldn't finish it and then go to hospital again. That made no sense. So all of the strategies that I was looking at, and I mean, everything from breathwork strategies, understanding cold therapies, right? So whether that's cold water therapies, ice baths, cold showers, what does that do? Why do people do these things? Whether I was looking at some, physical training, of course, I was just trying to find processes that allowed me to do those two things, to deliver the end goal, because life needs us to deliver. It's not good enough just to recover. We have to perform. But at the same time, developing the ability to sustain, our wherewithal to handle stress, to take on stress, to me, that's about recovery. I don't think stress takes you down. I think it's a misnomer. I think the lack of recovery that you build into your strategy will be the reason it takes you down. So the triathlon was just this metaphor that I wanted to take on to find ways to test these theories that I was coming across from studying not just high performers, but anyone from any walk of life that was able to take on a challenge and come out of it, having achieved their goal, but also feeling resourceful, not completely burnt out. That was really important to me.
Yeah, no, definitely. And one of the sort of recovery states you talk about was obviously the flow state, which is a word you hear a lot. And
Yeah,
so first of all, could you just describe what exactly flow state is, and how do you do
yeah,
it when life is really challenging?
yeah, like super challenging.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what is flow? I mean, flow. Most people are familiar with the phrase "being in the zone." So being in the zone, a flow state, athletes high, you often hear this phrase, athletes high, being in the pocket, I hear in sports sometimes, where people drop into this zone where everything just seems effortless.
Mm.
It's an action state where you tend to find there's a bit of time distortion. So you can be in flow and suddenly you feel like you've been having a conversation with somebody for like 20 minutes and like an hour's gone by, 2 hours have gone by, or you can be engrossed in a project, and again, similarly, you lose track of time. There's this time distortion. Everything seems to click when you're in flow. There's something called pattern recognition, where you seem to make quick decisions that make sense, and you seem to factor in, angles that you wouldn't normally think of. It's something that when I ask people, they can all describe having been in the zone or been in flow. But then I was going, so it's a thing then. We agree it's a thing, but how do you do it? To your question, let's say I need it tomorrow at 3 o'clock, right? I need to be in the zone tomorrow at 3 o'clock. I wanted a process that allowed me to be in control of it, rather than just bumping into it on occasion. So when I started to put in some time in researching this, and there were some great neuroscientists, a guy called Stephen Kotler, a guy in the US who's really taken on everything to do with flow. A guy called Professor Andrew Huberman, a guy from Stanford, again, someone well worth looking up, who really goes into the nuts and bolts of these psychological states. And in the book, what I've tried to do is be the conduit between these scientists and I'm a pragmatist. So I'm trying to go, like, I'm going to try and save you 100 hours here because I put the time in to find out. So, how do you get into flow? Well, I mean, there's a number of things. Flow follows focus. That's the golden rule. So if you're distracted, that's the first thing. If you're distracted, and look, we live in a world of distraction, right? I mean, I read this great article by a guy called Dresden Rosenstein, and I mentioned it in the book. And it started off with the question, what price for your attention?
Mm-hmm.
And he was saying that the senior programmers at Facebook, Google, Instagram were disconnecting themselves from the very platforms they designed to be so addictive. Right. And he was saying that the like button, for example, he described as a bright ding of pseudo pleasure. And he should know because he designed it. He created the like button. Originally, it was called the awesome button.
Okay.
But what he said that, look, the global average right now is 3 hours a day on social media. 3 hours a day is the average, touching, swiping our phones for 2,600 times a day. Now, I know it's not you and me, but the others, that's what the others are doing, 3 hours a day. So the point he's making is in a world of distraction, and distraction fractures our ability to be in the zone, how do you take control of your ability to focus, right? So that was my goal. So first of all, how do you do it? Well, one, you've got to deal with distraction. You've got to resist these impulses to kind of check the phone when you're in the middle of a block of work, to go on a snack run. You're not even hungry, right? To deal with the texts that are coming in or the notifications. If you really want to be in the zone, you've got to block out time. There's a technique they call focus sprinting, and a focus sprint, it's like a sprint is a short burst of energy, right? Mm-hmm. So a focus sprint is you block out, and I do this now, religiously twice a day when I've got things to do. Flow is not a state you get into for 8 hours. It's exhausting, right? But for 2 blocks a day, for 60 to 90 minutes, when you go, like, I've got to get this piece of work done. So during that 60 minutes, you set a timer, and I'm only half joking, where you go, this is sacred to get this piece of work done. Then you get a very clear goal. What are you trying to achieve in this 60 minutes, 60 to 90 minutes? What is your outcome? All right. And then you just shut off from everything else that can get in the way. Now, what you're doing there is you're recruiting the neural circuits in your brain that attend to focus and concentration. So when you dial in and you focus on something, what happens is your pupils dilate, you disconnect from everything else, and then the brain starts to release these very specific chemicals. So what is flow? Well, flow, when you're in that state of mind, your brain is releasing, we're not aware of this, right? Your brain's releasing dopamine. Dopamine's the reward chemical. So the anticipation of reward, I got 90 minutes to get this job done. That triggers this dopamine in your system. Adrenaline, right? That creates energy, right? Adrenaline, too much of it's a problem, but the right amount creates energy and drive. Anandamide, right, is another neurotransmitter which causes this ability to recognize patterns of information when you get super creative, right? Endorphins are your body's natural painkiller. So that's why you lose track of time. You feel good because you're focused on trying to achieve something. And then serotonin, which again is another feel-good chemical. It's almost that feeling of being comfortable sat in your seat. You're not thinking of being anywhere else. When those 5 neurotransmitters get released, and again, I know it's a bit sciencey, but that is flow, right? So what causes it is having a little bit of pressure, a little bit of risk. So you set a deadline, you focus on trying to achieve something. It's a bit like, I give the example oftentimes of if you were riding a bike out on the open road or across an open field, you don't need to be in the zone. There's no need. You're going to be perfectly fine, right? Mm-hmm. But if you suddenly start riding down a single track down the side of a mountain, the circumstances are so intense, the consequences are so great, your brain goes, I think you're going to need a little bit of this. And the brain starts to release these chemicals that tighten your focus, your pupils dilate, and you start to recruit the best of you in that situation, right? So when you think of those sort of examples, how do you create flow? Well, there's almost like a checklist. In the book, I go through a series of flow triggers, right? Clarity, purpose, drive, talent is a good flow trigger. Things you're good at, you tend to trigger flow, right? Deadlines, risk. These are all things you can build in to your environment during this 90-minute block of work, which makes it way more likely that the brain starts releasing these chemicals. All is at the end of it, you come out going, man, that was effective. I was effective because they kind of sum up flow by saying it's that state of mind or consciousness where you feel and perform at your best, right? And if you can find that like once a day, to me, it's a no-brainer because the return is undeniable, But anyway, that's how, and there's some very specific hacks and strategies in the book for how to tap into flow.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And one of the biggest things in that checklist, and I really wanted to ask this, which is how important is passion with that
Mm.
checklist?
Yeah, well, passion again. Think about what passion and purpose. If those two things go together, and I try to debrief both of those, passion and purpose. What do? Well, they recruit attention. Anything that you're passionate about causes you to focus on it, right? So, and also what passion tends to do also, it also gives you drive, it gives you commitment.
Mm.
And there's something really interesting about commitment. When you set goals, what is it about the goal that drives us forward? And also what kind of goal drives us? You want a goal that's it's almost like it's so exciting that it gets you up in the morning, but it's not too overwhelming that it keeps you up at night.
True.
It's trying to get that balance between I want to take on something that's maybe just on the edge of my skill set, right? But not too far outside. It's like if you go skiing. I don't ski, but I did see these charts with these different color ski runs, right? So if you're a great skier, you go down the black ski run because your skills match that challenge. If you're a novice, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't be in flow. It'd be too overwhelming. But if you're a black ski runner, you don't go down to the nursery slopes.
No.
But that's not there's no challenge there. So it's almost like if to provoke flow, you need to create a goal, some sort of aspiration that's right on the edge of your abilities. Why? Because you want your skills to be not underutilized, that you're so bored that you don't get excited, but not too overwhelming that you lose interest because you can't recruit the dynamics to kind of get you to move towards the challenge, right? The dopamine. So that's the strategy would be to get a goal that does both those things. It's exciting, you're passionate about it. Purposeful is a great one too, right? So if you can make a choice, if you can go look, whether someone's giving you a target in work, like your manager's giving you a target, you may or may not have selected, or the outside world has changed the game because of whether it's a pandemic, global markets, whatever the challenge is right now. But the real secret here is that you find a way to consciously select the goal. You go, look, I've been given the target, but I'm choosing to take it on. Right? I'm going to change my approach based on the outside dynamics that are changing in life, but I'm choosing my response. And I'm not trying to be overly positive here, but once you make a conscious selection and it's willful, that recruits purpose. It causes you to feel more passionate because you're deciding, I'm choosing to do this. And I know it's a reframe, that is a cognitive reframe, but it's such a clever way of thinking about a challenge because it gives you a sense of control that you're there willfully. It's a bit like, when I talked about, cold water therapies as an example, jumping in an ice bath or a cold lake or a cold shower, doing it on purpose because you're mindful of the benefits. So you've learned that it's good for the immune system. It helps you build resilience. It helps you burn fat, so there are some reasons for doing it. When you do it willfully and on purpose as part of your recovery strategy, you can recruit the wherewithal to step into that challenge. We had a problem with our boiler a few months ago. We had no hot water for about 2 weeks.
Oh,
So taking a cold shower, because we had no other choice, was miserable, right? And I take a cold shower every day. It's part of my process, right? But when I had to do it, it was a different challenge, right? So purpose and passion are things you do willfully. And I think that's the conduit. Understand, if I choose to do this, that recruits the part of the brain which creates dopamine, which causes me to move towards, right? Which is what a passion is, something that you tend to move towards.
Yeah, see, that's really interesting because, when you choose to do something, so for example, I think you described some of the activities as adventures, right? So,
Oh, yeah.
so why is it important to be prepared for them?
Yeah. I mean, look, I love that reframe of creating the paradigm that life is an adventure, or that not just life, the challenge you're moving towards is part of the adventure. And the only reason I like it is because it just changes the way it feels. If I say, look, what comes to mind when you think of the word adventure? What words come to mind? And I ask people all the time this, and I hear things like, exciting, challenging. Then I hear risk, danger, the unknown, development. And I make the observation that when you think of an adventure, the words aren't positive or negative. They're a mixture of both, right? An adventure isn't dependent on success or failure. The value of an adventure is the adventure itself. Intrinsically, there's a value in being on an adventure. If I say to people, we're going on an adventure, what happens is you psychologically lean in. You tend to go, what are we doing? Right? You tend to lean towards it, right? If I go, we're going on an adventure, people don't go, what, an adventure? You tend to kind of move in because the word triggers dopamine, right? It triggers that receptor where you go, I don't know what's going to happen, but I've labeled it as a predominantly good thing. That's what an adventure is. So, and I use this all the time when I'm saying, look, it's one thing setting a goal for the next 12 months. If I said, look, the last 12 months, all things considered, man, I don't know about you, it's been an adventure. It already feels a bit better if I label it like that, right? And if I go, I don't know what's going to happen for the next 12 months, who knows what's downstream, but I tell you something, it's going to be an adventure. Just taking the time to cause yourself to frame it in a way where it puts you on the front foot. That's the point of that phrase, right? It puts you on the front foot, and then you're going to go and experience it. And I'm not saying it's all going to be good. That's it. Challenge is built into it, right? But what it does do, it keeps you in a slightly more resourceful place to take on whatever happens within the adventure.
Yeah. No, and actually, exactly, which is if you're going to do those kind of things, so how do we get access the resources to sort of to be able to actually adapt to those kind of surroundings?
Yeah, I mean, adaptation is a really interesting one. And I talk about this in the first section of the book when I talk about potential. So I talk about three sections, right? So you've got tapping potential is about being better, developing the ability to be better. And I don't mean that in a contradictory sense. I mean, just the understanding that there's more to be had, right? It's a positive observation. And then the second part of the book is about tapping into mindset, which is all about focus. And the third part, tapping into physiology, this sort of mind-body connection, which is all about, I suppose, resilience to some extent. But how do you tap into the element of an adventure? How do you provoke yourself to step into that? Well, I use the word adapt in the first section of the book, and the acronym sets up 5 observations. And ADAPT stands for the process of adaptation. So it starts off with accepting the adventure. That's the first thing, right? Any journey of adaptation starts with, you've got to make it at least a conscious choice to accept there's something to be adapted to. And I really believe that the more you can adapt, the less you have to endure. And I think we can reflect on that. If I say, look, the last 2 or 3 years, unbelievable set of circumstances we've had to experience. Nobody expected it. No one saw it coming. Nobody wanted it, right? And what was unique about it was everyone experienced it at the same time. That's highly unusual. There's the phrase you often hear at conferences is the VUCA world: volatility, uncertain, complex, and ambiguity. These 4 things all showed up at the same time for everybody we knew. Unbelievable. So when that happens, that was an endurance test. I don't know about you. It depends on what you did for a living. I have some clients that did this during the pandemic, and I had some that fell off a cliff. And I spent my life flying around the world speaking at conferences. There was no need for that for about 18 months, right?
God.
So there had to be a period of either endurance or adaptation. And I see it like a hydraulic. The more you can adapt, the less you have to endure. If you haven't been able to adapt over the last 2 or 3 years, this has been a painful endurance test, and it will continue to be so. So to your question, how do you adapt? Accept the adventure. Once you accept the adventure, you then start to direct a part of the brain called the seeking system, where you start to create, to your point about passion. So I've accepted the adventure. Now, what am I trying to achieve? What's my direction? What am I trying to move towards? If you can work that out, and I use this phrase, this sort of direction of travel. I interviewed the managing director of Brother, the tech company, at a conference a couple of years ago, Phil Jones. And he talked about this. He said, during the pandemic, we didn't know what our vision was. We couldn't be specific about it because things were so challenging. But I just helped my team to go, let's be clear about our dot on the horizon, our DOT, our direction of travel. I love that concept. So accept the adventure, get your dot on the horizon, some direction of travel. And then you have to then adopt the ADA. The A stands for adopt the new and the improved. You've got to develop yourself. There's got to be some skills you're going to need to develop whilst you're adapting. the chances are the new world requires you to be better at certain things. So accept the adventure, direct your seeking system, adopt the new and improve, be willing to develop yourself. And then P is persist, persist, persist.
Mm.
Because adaptation doesn't happen in a heartbeat, right? It takes focus, man. You gotta have some drive, and you've got to be able to persist and push through the challenge, right? And as long as you have that passion you talked about, that's way more likely. And then the T of adapt stands for tune in and tune up. And tune in, tune up means become really aware of what you're getting from your efforts. And again, marginal gains I talk about at the back end of that section. Marginal gains are, what are the things I can get slightly better at? Can I get slightly more focused? Can I get a little more recovered? Can I get a little more driven, a little more motivated, just a little bit, right? And if you can work on those changes on a daily basis, what am I doing well? Right, recognize that each week, right? What are the things I'm learning that I need to improve? And then what are those areas I need to change just quickly over the next week? If you think like that, and that's how you tune up your approach, ADAPT, adapt, starts to show up in your life. You start to make gains and get traction.
Yeah, no, definitely. And yeah, no, I like that too, because I like having a bit of the data that sort of backs up the things that I feel comfortable with actually practically doing. So yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I agree. So I love the book. So it was
Well,
fantastic for
thank you.
me. So
Appreciate
yeah,
that.
huge thanks, Jim, for joining me today. Really hope that it helps other people as well, who's
Yeah, me
also
too.
just trying to find their potential and just be unashamedly superhuman themselves.
There you
Um,
go.
and then I managed to say the word as well, which is a miracle in itself. So huge thanks, Jim, for joining me today.